Hi everyone, Kat here again. We're going to go ahead and piece another block in our Getting to Know You quilt. So this month we're going to put block number 8, Getting to Know Green. We're going to put this one together. So I have all of my pieces for this block cut out in front of you, minus my frame A and frame B's. So we have our green cloud, block A and B, and then our hunter bubble, block A, B, and C, and then our seed background, and I'm doing the medium gray, and we have our A and our C squares. So the first block we're going to put together, the first section, that we're going to create is the stitch and flip square in a square. So we're going to be doing this unit right here. And I just did one and it looks like this. So this one is pretty easy. Notice that we're working with squares this month. Up to right now, we don't have any triangles that we've cut, and actually we're not going to be cutting any, so oh, nope. Yes, we are. Well, we're going to make our half square triangles on the next page. Anyway, we're going to start out with all squares. So to make this unit, you're going to start with your green cloud A square and your hunter bubbles B. And you're going to need 4 of these and 1 of your A square. And we're going to piece this. We're going to put these, attach these squares kind of in a clockwise motion. So the step 1 says to draw a line, diagonal line from corner to corner, doesn't matter which corners. And then you're going to lay them right sides together. And you're going to put your little B squares on top of your A square. Just make sure that your corner here is touching an outside edge of the block underneath, the square, underneath, and then this corner again. And what I like to do is just stick a little pin on each end, and it just keeps my fabrics from moving as I'm sewing them. Now for this, you don't need to use a 1/4 inch foot. I'm going to use my regular sewing foot with my needle in the middle so that I can just eyeball this. So let me move the camera over here and show you how I'm going to do this. Here we go. So I'm going to get everything lined up here. And we're just going to sew right down the center of this line we marked. And make sure you come right off the edge there. One other tip I'll give you on this, and that is when you're marking those center lines, you can't really line the ruler up on that center line, because then we're going to be marking to one side. So you want to pull the ruler back so that it's not exactly in the corner here or here. That way when you mark your line, you know you're right on the corners. You're going to go to the iron. You're going to press it flat first. Then this is the one time you can use the edge of the iron to scooch this over. And in a perfect world, these tips will match, and that looks nice. Now, this block here, this unit here, I just completed, and I've already trimmed. You have to trim away the background before you can add the next square. You don't want all that bulk in there. So I've done that to the first 3. And then this is my last square that I attached, and I've pressed it. You can see that it's nice and crisp. So now I'm just going to trim this away. And again, I just eyeballed this. You wanted about a quarter or a scant quarter. And then your unit is done. So we need to make 8 total of these units, 4 for each block, and we're making 2 blocks this month. So I'm gonna go and get busy and finish my other units, and I'll meet you back here for the next step. Okay, I'm back, and the next unit we're going to put together is the half square in a square unit. This unit looks like this, and it's going to be very similar to the first unit we just made, except for we're just going to put corners on 2 adjacent corners instead of all 4. And we're using a piece of our background seed fabric. And I believe that's our A block. And again, they tell us to mark that diagonal from corner to corner. And sew your first one on, trim, sew your second one on, press and trim. And many of you probably remember from a previous video, I know earlier I said I was marking them, and then I wanted to show you my alternate method, which is sort of a shortcut, I think. Instead of actually drawing that line from corner to corner, I fold my square in half diagonally, press it. I usually press it so that the outside, the pretty fabric is showing on the outside. And then we can just pin this. I'm getting ready to sew this final corner on this unit. So we'll go ahead, I'm gonna pin it right up here and then turn it around. And I wanna make sure that they're meeting on the side, and I'm gonna pin this and sew it. So we're gonna be making 8 of these units, 4 for each one of our blocks. And then I'll just sew that and trim it and press it up. So then once we have our half square and a square units made, and I've got 3 of them done, we are then going to sew one of our previous units with our half square and a square unit. And we're gonna, actually the picture shows it this way, so let me get this oriented correctly. So these should match up, and they do. So we're gonna sew these 2 units together. It really doesn't matter which side you sew it to. They're all the same, but you definitely wanna make sure that the dark green fabric that's on the adjacent sides on your seed fabric is being sewed to this, let me see what they call this, square and a square unit. Stitch and flip square and a square is what it's technically called. So let me just show you how I put these together. I'm a little fussy when I am sewing units that have a point that are supposed to be touching each other or very close to touching each other. You can see on this unit here, I've already sewn these together, and notice I did press this open flat, the seam allowance. It's just gonna help it, and I'll get up really close so you can see this. They're basically kissing. So here is my method for doing that. So I'm gonna flip this one down, and let me just get that seam. Got a little thread there that doesn't want it to lay flat. I'll start from this side. I'm gonna take a pin. This is, it's a pin stab is what I guess it's called. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a pin and I'm gonna push it through from the wrong side on my 1 unit. And I'm gonna turn around here and peek. And I want that pin to come out right at the top of that triangle. And it's close, but it's off just a teeny bit. So I'm gonna move it over just a smidge, and then I'll turn it over so you can see. Still off just a bit. There. I'm on the looking at this on an angle, so trying to show you with the camera, and I just dropped it, excuse me. There we go. All right. I don't think that's pressed out all the way. I'm making this look really difficult, and it usually isn't. Okay, there I go. Where's the camera? Here it is. So my pin, if you can see that, but my pin is coming from the wrong side through to the right side. Now, this is the easier part. I'm gonna sew this unit to this unit. So now I'm gonna take my pin and I'm just gonna push it right through there. Try and get this close, right through there. Now I'm gonna put these two together. Now, in a perfect world, I could just slap these together and sew them, and they'd probably come out either right on or almost right on. So what I do, this is the important thing, is you wanna make sure your pin is going through your fabric straight. So you don't want your pin looking like this or like this. You want it straight. So you know that you have those 2 points lined up. And before I pull that out, I'm gonna take another pin and I'm gonna go through, pin through everything on the left, because I'm gonna sew down the seam from here to here. So I wanna pin and secure it right before that intersection. I wanna make sure that my needle is straight, and it kind of did a little. There. Now I'll pull this pin, sorry about that. I'll pull this pin and I'm gonna go to the machine and I'm gonna sew this. Let me bring the camera over here and hopefully you can see this. So I'm gonna start here. My pin is got this intersection secured right before I'm gonna get to that point. So we'll go ahead and start to sew. Now I'm at the shop today sewing, and I left my 1/4" foot without the flange at home. So because I have a flange on here, I'm gonna hit my pin. So I just needed to stop there and make sure my pin is under. So I'm gonna line up my front edge now, and I'm just gonna go ahead and sew through this nice and slow to make sure that fabric doesn't move on me. Go all the way through. Let's cut our thread, excuse me. Pull our pin, and then let's see how we did. And there is our seam, and our points are directly across from each other. So what that means is we might have a little discrepancy out here on the edge, but that's well within our seam allowance, and that can be trimmed up or just taken into consideration when we sew this to the next unit. So these are called the stacked diamond units. I'm going to turn it over here because that's the way it shows it in the book. So we need to make 8 of these units, and we'll use 4 for each block. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of mine together so we can get the rest of our units together for this block. I'll be right back. The next unit we're going to make are our half square triangle units with both our lighter green fabric and our darker green fabrics. So to prep these, you're going to take your C-square of your background, and I believe it's the larger, it's a 3.5 inch square of both your seed background and your dark green, and then again the seed background and our cloud fabric. Right sides together. You're going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner, and on this particular application, I would go ahead and draw that line. I'm using a black friction pen here to draw this. And then what I do is, to make this easy on yourself, set your machine up for 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but then pop on your regular foot so that you don't have to deal with your little flange here on the edge, because it kind of puts a lot of pressure on this diagonal seam as you're seaming it. And as long as you've got your machine set up for 1/4 of an inch, you can just run the edge of your regular sewing foot right along that drawn line. And I like to strip piece these. So I go all the way down one side and then turn around and come back the other. The thing you want to make sure of before you cut these apart is you want to take them to the iron and press them, because this is a bias right here. So I'm going to go press these. I'm going to cut them apart. I'm going to press them open. And then what we need to do is we need to trim these units down to 2 7/8. So I just did a preliminary little measurement on these, and the good thing is these are measuring about 3 inches. So we've got 1/8 of an inch to trim off, which is nice because we're going to make sure that every one of our half square triangle units is identical in size, and it's just going to make putting the block together that much nicer and easier. So I'm going to go ahead and get these ready, and I'll be right back. Okay. We have our half square triangle units finished, trimmed up to 2 7/8, and they came out really nice. Just want to remind you that when you're pressing these, we always want to press to the dark side. So if you always remember to have your triangle unit with the dark piece of fabric on top, you're going to press it like you sewed it, flip it up, press it open, then your seam allowance is always going to be towards the fabric that you have on the top of your stack. So dark's always on top, and then you have your seam allowance pressed to the dark. All right, now we are going to make the triangle corner units using our half square triangles that we just made and our A blocks of our light green cloud fabric. So this is how we're going to lay them out. We're going to have our A block here, 2 of our half square triangle units with our dark green facing each other, and then our last half square triangle unit with the light green cloud is going to point away from our A square with our seed fabric kind of in between. So the book tells us to sew these 2 together here along this side, and then sew these 2 together along this side. But we want our seam allowance towards the A block here, the solid A square, and then our seam allowance here going in the opposite direction. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these 2 units and then press our seam allowances to opposite sides and then nest them, and I'll show you how I do that, and we'll be right back. So I have my block just rotated one degree from the picture in the book, but it doesn't really matter. We have to sew all 4 of these together. So what I did was I pressed my seam allowance towards my solid square, and then I pressed this one to the opposite side. Now I'm going to sew these 2 together, and again, I've shown you this in a different video, but it's worth repeating because this is how I ensure that all of my intersections come out perfect. So you can see that we have locking seam allowances here. They kind of lock together. Oops, sorry. So they're going in opposite directions, and they will Just push them together here and they'll lock. And then I put one pin to the left of that seam, to the left. So it holds down the seam allowance in the back, so it does two things. Then I'm just gonna line up this side, make sure when I end, I'm lined up here, and now I'm gonna sew through here. I'm not gonna pull that pin until I'm done. So let me scoot the camera over here. And let's go ahead and sew this. I have my regular sewing foot on so that I don't have to deal with the flange on the side of it and my pin. I'm gonna just stop here and line up the front of my blocks here, and if there's any easing that needs to be done, I'll do that. There's just a little teeny bit here. And again, I'm gonna leave that pin in there until I get all the way through. And then let's take this out and look at that intersection. So we'll take the pin out and voila. We have a beautiful, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that right there. And I'm kind of picky when it comes to piecing, and I want those intersections to line up. And if you look over here, we've got another beautiful angle here, and here's my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm not gonna sew that point off. Again, up here, I've got a beautiful 1/4 inch seam allowance. When I sew this to the next section, I'm not gonna sew my tip off. Again here, and again here. This one looks like it might be a little scant, but we can make that come out. So I am gonna go ahead and press this, and then I'm gonna make my other 3 units, and then we're ready to lay the center of our block out. So I'll be right back. Okay, we have all of our units complete, and now we can put the interior of our block together. So we're going to go ahead and put these together in rows, just like we've done in the past. So our center row, we're going to press our seam allowances towards our center block. And then the bottom row and the top row, we're going to press our seam allowances towards the 2 outside larger units. That way, when we go to sew our rows together, our seams will be offset, out, in, and out, and reverse on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and put my rows together and meet you right back here. Okay, I have my 3 rows, and now we're going to put those together. So I want to show you on my center unit, I have a little discrepancy here, and I don't want to cut it off. I started just a smidge high. Let's see if I can get this in a place so you can see it. 1 thread. I started 1 thread off here, but I ended up more than 1 thread short. That's because this corner wasn't quite cut. Probably it wasn't cut exact. My paints pretty much line up. It's 1 thread up from this. 1 thread, it's not worth me ripping out. I'm not gonna rip it out, but I wanna show you how I deal with this little notch thing so that when I put my block together, you don't really see it. So I'm gonna lay it in the center like this. I'm gonna flip it over, and here's how I pin these rows together. I start at the left-hand side, because this is where we're going to start at the seam at the top. So I'm going to pin as close to the end as possible. I'm going to jump to my first intersection, and I'm going to line the seam up, and these 2 pretty much line up height-wise. So I'm going to line that up, and I'm going to put a pin just to the left of that seam. So let me show you that, just to the left. Now, if I have a discrepancy in here, which I do, and in a lot of these blocks we do, because, again, because we're not using templates, and we're cutting squares in half diagonally, either once or twice to get as close, and then we kind of trim everything up. There are going to be instances like this where we're going to have just a little discrepancy. So as you're sewing this, you're going to just gently pull that out so that they match as you're stitching, and nobody will ever know that was there. So I'm going to go to my next intersection, and again I'm going to line it up. Now this one I have a little dip here, so I'm going to drop this down so that the two top edges meet, and I have a couple of threads here at this top edge on this piece. So I'm going to leave it there because it's within my seam allowance and nobody's going to know it was there. Again, I'm going to put a pin to the left of that seam. You can't even see it. The thread is matching up. And again, if I have any discrepancy, I'm going to just gently ease that in. I'm going to jump to the center. I'm going to line those two pieces together, put a pin, and then I'm going to jump over here. I'm off to the side, so I can't really see unless I look in the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this to the left. And then here's that little area where my block didn't quite extend as far up as the rest of my row. So what I'm going to do is I am going to leave this with the same amount of block underneath peeking out, and then I'm going to pin this one right here, and I'm going to sew my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and that discrepancy is going to be within my seam allowance. So let me get another pin, move the camera, and I'll show you how I'm going to sew this. Here's my last pin. And again, because I'm using pins, I'm not using that 1/4 of an inch foot with a flange, but I do have my needle in the 1/4 inch position. That way, I can go ahead and sew right over these pins, and I'm not going to hurt my machine. These, again, are those skinny quilt piecing pins, and they're the skinniest pin out there that you can buy, and I love them for quilt piecing because I can sew right over them and I don't have to worry. Now I'm going to make sure this is lined up. So basically what I do is I sew from pin to pin, and if I have to do any easing, then I do it in between. And notice I'm just looking to make sure that this edge is lined up, and if I have to, I'll just pull that into position and hold it there. And again, I'm going to tuck that under there. There we go. And I'm going to sew right up to there. Now I'm going to get this all in line. And there's that little bit extra peeking out. I probably could drop this down just a smidge to make that a little more uniform right there. See that? And now I'm going to line my presser foot up with the bottom, the fabric that's on the bottom, so that I get a perfect 1/4 of an inch. Just like that. And let's see how that looks. Let's see how my intersections look. And again, I'll show you that end, that end block here, where those just don't match up on the edge. But I think once we open this up, let's check our intersections. So there's the first one, and that looks real good. The second one, that one is right on. See if I can get it close here. Beautiful. Third one, right on. This technique works. Fourth one, right on. Okay, so now this is going to lay nice and flat because I fudged that that little discrepancy on this last block. I don't have quite the seam allowance I should, but it's gonna lay flat in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the last row on here, give it a quick press, and I'll be right back. One last thing before we go. I brought this over to the pressing area and pressed the rows that I had just sewn together. And what I noticed was that the center skinny sections wanted to draw in a little bit because these are heavily pieced. These are not pieced as much. So what I've done, I'm going to try and do a close-up, is I took and stuck a couple of pins in an angle into my pressing area. So I started here, and then I pulled this taut so that it would come out even with my corners. And then I started on this side, pinned this side down, pulled this one out so that I'm getting a straight line here and it's not bowing in on me. And then I'm using my great little Rowenta power steamer here, and I'm not touching it. I'm just steaming it. And now I'm gonna just let this sit and cool, and all the fibers just dry into this position so that when I take the pins out, it's gonna maintain this nice square shape. And I love the way this block came out. I think it's super pretty. I'm gonna leave you here without putting the block frames on. We've done that every month now, and I actually left them at home and I'm doing this video at work. So again, the block frames, you can either put your side frames on first, trim, and then put your top and bottom, or you can start with the top and bottom and finish with the sides. And then again, we're going to trim the entire block up after we get it on there. So I hope you enjoyed piecing block 8 of Getting to Know You, and we'll meet right back here next month, May 1st, for block 9. See you then.